So as a history teacher, if I may provide a little bit of historical context for um, racism, which I'll specifically name as white supremacy as the predominant form of racism that we experience, and how it plays into the discipline disparities and disproportionality. I think it's important to go back to the foundations of race and scientific racism, uh, the social construct of race and how it was introduced. It comes from Europe. It was created by Europeans. It is not based on science. It is not based on anything other than phenotype, hair texture, skin color, body type, etc. But it seeped its way into what we consider popular culture, and so we see it theologically in this belief in the curse of Ham and all of his descendants, namely Canaan, used as the justification for enslavement. Um, we see it in popular culture in the archetypes of like the writings of William Shakespeare and the character of Caliban, who's kind of viewed as a savage who's unreformable. And it ultimately becomes a justification for the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery, New World slavery, which is um, the largest forced migration of human beings in the history of the world, the planet, and institution of perpetual slavery, where not just a person, but the progeny is enslaved for life. Um, that's important because for African descended folks, Africans and Africa is viewed as a dark continent, a people with no history, a people with no soul, no capability. And so, in the pursuit of introducing them to Christianity and reforming, civilizing them, it justifies any form of violence, whether you're whipping them, whether you're, you know, um, clamping, branding them. It's all done in the name of civilizing them. It's a form of civilizing. And so that disposition toward, that violent disposition toward Black people of African descent, is foundational to how the United States is formed and how Black people are treated as a result of that. Um, Fast forward, right, to you could say the turn of the last century and last 100 or so years, where Black people are struggling for educational equity. We're lobbying and fighting to receive equal treatment, not only in public amenities, but in the education system. And so prior to that, you had separate and fundamentally unequal school systems where Black people schools were underfunded, under resourced. But ironically, there were a lot of stories of Black people receiving a very good quality education despite that structural impediment, that structural barrier. Those are stories that don't often get told unless you read from researchers like North Carolina's own Vanessa Siddle Walker or Michelle Foster. That Black people in many cases were doing more with less. But researchers like Russell Skiba point to the point of desegregation. I won't say integration because that's a state of harmony, but desegregation as a turning point when it comes to discipline. That's when we start to see what are now called discipline disparities, when we start sending Black kids into predominantly white spaces because we desegregated the students, but we never desegregated the personnel, the teachers. In fact, most uh, Black and brown teachers, North Carolina, second to Texas alone, we lost more Black educators as a result of desegregation because they just simply weren't grafted and absorbed into the system.
Wow.
So you're sending Black kids into environments where systemic racism is still the order of the day, white supremacy is still the order of the day, and so they're otherized. Their their ways of speech are otherized. Their behaviors are otherized, and that's when you begin to see what are called discipline disparities in the early mid 70s, according to researchers like Russell Skiba. Um, it's important because even now, man, in Charlotte, but in North Carolina and across the nation, Black kids are suspended at several times the rate of their white counterparts. And one could look at that and again kind of apply a very racist lens and say, well, that's because they behave worse, right? Obviously, it's disproportionate or behavior that's worthy of exclusionary discipline. But again, the research literature doesn't add up. What they find instead is that the things that Black kids get suspended for oftentimes the discretionary things, the things where our biases live. So you have what are categorical or objective offenses that nobody's going to argue about. Bring a gun to school, you light a trash can on fire, you assault staff. That's one thing. Those are objective offenses. Um, but then there are subjective offenses. These are things like insubordination, disrespect, aggressive behavior. Well, how do you tease that apart from the racial history of this country? How do you tease that apart from the way that racism shows up? And in North Carolina, Charlotte is no exception. That's where the greatest disproportionality really exists, is in those subjects. Somebody's making a judgment call about who is disrespectful, who is threatening.
Right.
And, so like, how do you look at that apart from like just I don't know if you've seen the data in North Carolina of who gets pulled over by police.
Yeah.
By Yeah, it's the same thing. So one just has to ask the question, you know, how do you really look at that and say that racism isn't at play? In fact, if we're being intellectually honest, you got to think that that plays a huge factor. So that's our present context, man. I kind of took you a 400-year journey,
Yeah.
but those are the roots of the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah. The so you used the term that is quite descriptive, that there was a violent disposition
Yeah,
towards um, black people, right? Or towards people who were made to be black, maybe as the racialized system develops. And so from what you're describing is that that disposition really has not changed, and it continues to show up in our schools in the way that that black students in particular are dealt with.
accurate. Yeah, it hasn't changed materially, maybe in its appearance, but in terms of the outcomes, not much.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I really admire about Creed and the work that you're doing there, as I've attended a couple of online events, is that for one, you're very explicit that we're aiming at systemic change here. We're thinking large scale,
Hmm.
and for two, that like we're not gonna. How do I say this? So you're aiming at large scale, and you're gonna attack the issues and not sort of the symptomatic stuff. We're gonna go deep, right?
Right.
So help us to get a vision. Help us to sort of spark our imaginations. If we were to reinvent an educational system that serves our black and brown students well, that serves in particular our black students well,
Right.
what's that going to look like? What are the sorts of things that we're going to have to change? Architecture, curriculum,
Hmm. Hmm.
staffing, all that stuff.
Yeah. The answer is all that stuff, right?
Right, right. Yeah,
But I appreciate the invitation to imagine, and I can only think of a place where the identities of those children are affirmed, are invited in, where they aren't made to fracture parts of themselves, where only they can only bring 3/5 of who they are into a classroom, but they can bring the whole of who they are. Um, where routinely they are told what they can do instead of what they cannot do, where their languages, their dispositions, their ways of knowing, right? Their own, cultural, you know, epistemologies, right?
yeah,
Are allowed to be present, where they see themselves in the curriculum and it's holistic and it's relevant and it's honest, not artificially, right? I'm more of an Afrocentrist, right? So, and that doesn't denote the fact that you teach, you know, European accomplishments. It's what it says is couple that with centering other racial and ethnic groups as well, right? So when you interrogate science, you can't just talk about European contributions. You have to talk about the African, the Asian, the Latin American contributions as well, and on with math as well, right, or any other subject for that matter. But also where it's aimed not so much just about job readiness,
yeah,
but it's about civic preparedness, man. It's
Hmm.
about being a good global citizen, and to make the sort of calculations and thoughts that interrogate so, solving social problems in the same way that we solve um, mathematical problems. That would be sort of my dream, for how we change things, and of course, a staff that reflects the diversity of the students and teaches in a way that's emancipatory, that's liberatory. So we got a long way to go before we get there.
Right, right. Yeah, so when we were talking about initiating this conversation, um, one of the things you were pointing to me was like, I'm going to be predisposed to action here. I don't want to
Right,
be sitting around and talking about this anymore.
right,
So we know what to do. We've got folks like you on the state board of education with these big imaginations who can help us to see an alternative.
hmm
So what are a handful of the steps
hmm
that we can make right now?
yeah, yeah. So the most immediate thing I would say is think of an issue, right? We're talking about discipline disparities as an issue,
Right.
but it could be school funding, right? It could be uh, language access for newcomers, whatever, right? Think of
Right.
an issue and think of where the power lives. Investigate, okay, who are the people, the key decision makers to impact change? That's one step we don't do. Do we know who's on our local board of education? Is that the lever? Or is it a state level? Is it me, right? The state board, or maybe it's the General Assembly, the House or the Senate. Maybe it's a federal issue. Find out where the power lives to make the change on that particular issue
Okay.
and immediately start engaging those players, right? Figure out what it is you want to see happen, figure out where the power lives, and start engaging those folks to make those sort of changes. That's a step that most of us don't take. But really, what we're talking about is getting involved in education policy. That's those are the rules that govern the game. And if I can make any recommendation, it just be that. Do you know who the local board members are? Do you know which regions they represent on the CMS board? Do you know who was on the state board of education and what we do?
Yeah.
Find that stuff out right now.
Yeah. 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 So nothing wrong necessarily with volunteering at a school, right? But
Right.
to be working at that level as well, on the policy level.
Absolutely.
This is what
Right.
I'm seeing. This is, and unlearning the biases that you say we're bringing into the spaces we.
Yeah. And as a 1B, I would say, start thinking of, at Creed, our thing is we center students of color, right? Start thinking of what that means to center students of color
Okay.
and to create an education system where the experiences of students of color actually govern the decisions we make. And so start thinking about what students of color need and making decisions that are in alignment with that, because ultimately the facts are, if we do those things, everybody ultimately benefits because, as we're doing through the least of these, right?
That's
Is
right.
essentially the principle that's at work there.
Yeah. 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 All right. Well, thank you for the good work that you're doing in the world that continues to inspire and to agitate and to irritate in the right places at times. So we appreciate your boldness and and your good work that you're doing. Thanks for being with us this evening.